In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to use the Monarch Flyin location. What this does is it makes a little box fly in from the bottom corner of your page and it asks them to share. And you can trigger this fly in based on various different triggers, all of which are customizable within the Monarch settings panel. So before we get into all of the fly-in settings, let me just show you what the fly-in is. So as you can see, I'm on a post here, and as I scroll down the post, a little fly-in comes here. It's a little box with sharing buttons and a message. So now, before you can use the fly-in, you first have to enable the fly-in location. So to do that, go to Tools, Monarch Settings, and the first page you'll be greeted with here is your location management page. So you want to go over to the fly-in location and click that, and you can see once it's enabled, you get a little green check mark, and the fly-in has now been enabled. So after it's been enabled, you can configure the fly-in by going over to the fly-in tab here, which will give you all the settings related to the fly-in location. So we have a bunch of settings here. We have the icon style, shape. You can adjust the title and the message that appears. You can choose the location, left or right. You can adjust various design settings such as the icon alignment and the number of columns, the animation. Next up, we have our triggers, which adjusts what user action will trigger the pop-up, whether it be automatic or at the bottom of the post after commenting, etc. And then moving down, we have custom color settings, and then the post type settings, which controls where that fly-in will appear on your website on a post type basis. So you could have it only display on pages, only display on your home page, only display on posts, or only display on any post type you have, such as custom post types that come in plugins such as WooCommerce and the product post type, or Divi and the project post type. Okay, so let's adjust a couple of these settings and I'll show you what they do on the demo here. So first up is our icon style, which adjusts the hover animation of the buttons within the fly-in. So you can actually preview the different animation styles just by hovering over each of these. And so I have this nice flip animation selected. Next up is our icon shape. You can choose between rectangle, rounded rectangle, or circle. So I'm going to change to circle just to show you what that looks like. And next up is the title and the message. And you can adjust the title and the message that appears above the button. So right now it says tell your friends, but you could change that to please share our post. And if you don't want to use a title or message, you can just delete it. So let's say I want a title and no message below it. Just delete the title text in the input field here and then save, and it'll just disappear. So I'm saving those changes, and then we're going to take a look here. I'm going to refresh the page and trigger the fly-in, so you can see the text below the title has been erased because I deleted it, and then the title itself has been changed, the text of the title, and the buttons have been changed to a circle instead of the rounded rectangle. So those are just a couple of the settings you can play around with to start. Heading back to our settings page, I'm going to change back to my rounded rectangle shape. I'm going to put a message in here. And then we're going to move on to the display settings. So the first display setting is the location of the fly-in itself, whether it be either on the bottom right of your page or the bottom left of your page. It's up to you. So right now it's on the right, but I could change it to the left. And the next is the icon alignment, which can either be left or centered. This will adjust the location of the icon within each button. So if you were paying attention to the demo I just showed you, the icon was on the left. But if you want to have it centered, which will center the icon and the title of the network as well as the share count, you can do that. So I can change this to centered, and I'll show you what that looks like. Next up is the number of columns. So you can adjust the grid of buttons that appears within the fly-in. So you can have either one column, which will stack them all the buttons on top of each other, or you can have two columns, which will put two buttons side by side, or three. And yeah, it really depends how many buttons you're trying to put in there. So the less buttons you have, the more liberties you have with how small your column structure is. So let's say you had 20 buttons and you chose one column. Those are going to stack up pretty high. I might get a little weird looking. So it's really up to you. We give you the ability to control that on your own, so you can make that decision. But I'll change it to 1 just to show you what that looks like. Okay, so refreshing, I have changed it over to the left here, and I've changed the icon setting alignment to centered. I have changed the column structure to one column, and as you can see, what I was saying here, because we have so many buttons enabled, that one column structure really creates a pretty tall fly-in. So I would advise only to use that when you just have a few buttons. So it's pretty common to only use the most popular sharing buttons, which are Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. So if you only have those 3 buttons enabled, then the one column structure actually looks much nicer than using a 2 column structure, because not only because it fills out the fly-in more, but also because 3 buttons in a 2 column structure will result in an empty space on the 4th column, or the 4th field of the column. And one more thing you can mention is that the centered icon style, which results in a stacking of the icon and the text. So when you stack the icon and the text and keep everything centered, it's going to naturally make the button bigger. So using the centered location, the centered alignment of the icons results in larger buttons. So again, this is I would suggest using this when you have fewer buttons enabled. So you can kind of play with those settings with the columns and the icon alignment to adjust how big the buttons are and how big that fly-in appears. So just to give you an example, I'm going to keep the one column structure the same, but then I'm going to change the icon alignment to left, which will actually result in a smaller button, and it'll make this fly-in look a little bit less aggressive with these 6 sharing locations enabled, or six networks enabled. So change the icon alignment back to left and save, and you can see that these buttons will get a lot smaller once everything's not stacked. So you can see that's a much better result in this case when we're using one column and 6 sharing profiles. Okay, heading back. One other thing about the column structure is that there's a 4th option, which is auto width. So the auto width won't confine your buttons to any particular column width. They will only be as big as they need to be to house the content within them. So what that means is they're just going to be as big as they need to be to fit the icon and the title of the network. So the button's going to get bigger for networks with bigger names and so on. But if you're trying to squish a lot of buttons in to the fly-in using auto width and then disabling network names and network counts will result in these like nice little square buttons. So just to give you an example, let's say I want to fit a lot more networks in here. I can enable auto width, and then I can disable network names. And you can see this is going to result in just these little small square buttons here. So like I said, auto width doesn't force them to be any specific column structure. It's not forcing them to be 50% width, let's say, with a 2 column structure. They're just as big as they need to be to house, in this case, the icon by itself, which results in nice small buttons. Okay. Going back, I'm going to switch back to a 2 column structure. And next up is the intro animation. So this is the animation that occurs when the fly-in appears. So by default, I just have it as fade in, but you can either disable the animation by choosing no animation, or you can choose from one of our many other animations, such as slide up from the bottom, slide in from the left or right, or some of these more crazy ones like a swinging animation or a bounce animation or a flip. So let's change it to flip. This is one of those animations that will definitely grab your visitor's attention. So scrolling down, you can kind of see it flips in and anchors, which is a pretty cool effect. Next up are the triggers. So this is where you can really control who gets shown the fly-in and what actions they take to trigger that fly-in. So one of the most basic triggers is the time delay. So this will just automatically show that fly-in to everybody who has been on your page for a certain amount of time. So if you enable this, you're going to get a second option, which is the delay in seconds that you want to use. So I've enabled trigger after time delay, and I've input a time of 5 seconds, which means that anyone who's on a page for 5 seconds will get shown the fly-in. So this is great to only hit users who are like engaged with the post. You know, let's say they've been reading. If they've been on your page for more than 5 seconds, they're obviously at least a little bit interested. And if they've been on your page even longer, they're even more interested. So you can kind of play with that range. You know, when do you think is the the best time to ask the visitor to share? And you can experiment that with yourself. I would say generally you want to use something more like 20 seconds, but it's really up to you. And I'm going to keep it at 5 for now, just so I can show you and I don't have to wait so long. So I'm going to enable the time delay. It's set to 5 seconds. And if I refresh the page and kind of just sit here for 5 seconds, you'll see that the Flyin will appear. And there you go. Okay, moving on to the next trigger. Trigger after inactivity. So this works just like the time delay, but that time countdown only comes into effect when the user has been inactive. So let's say they have read your post and they opened a new tab and went to some other site, and they kind of forgot about your page, and they go to get lunch and they come back and they open up your tab again, and instead of just closing the tab and going, oh yeah, I've seen this before, now you've greeted them with a new action for them to follow. So it's a way to kind of recapture the attention of people who you may have lost otherwise. So like I said, if someone leaves your page for a certain amount of time, so you can enable this trigger and then adjust the idle timeout. So in this case, I'm going to change it to 5 seconds again and save, and you can see that if I'm reading the post and this is enabled, I'm not going to get hit with a pop-up while I'm active, but if I go inactive and I stop moving around for a little while, in this case 5 seconds, that Flyin is going to appear. There you go. Next up is the trigger at the bottom of post. So this is one of my favorite triggers because it only targets visitors who are engaged with your post and therefore are most likely to share with your post. So in this case, it only pops up when someone has read through your entire page and finished reading your page. So obviously they enjoyed it if they finished reading it. So I'm going to enable the trigger at the bottom of post and show you that. Refresh here. So I'm reading, I scroll down, and once I hit to the bottom, I get asked to share. So this is a great way to not, risk annoying all of your visitors and then only engaging with those who have enjoyed your content and are likely to share it. Next up is the trigger after commenting. So this also targets your most engaged users. In fact, it targets perhaps your absolutely your most engaged users, which are those who have interacted with your post. So they've read your post, they've enjoyed the post so much that they've decided to comment on the post. And so now they're very invested in the post and they're very likely to share it. So this simply asks them to share after they've commented on it. So I'm going to enable this. Oops. I forgot to save here. Trigger after commenting. I'm going to go to the post and then scroll down. So in this case, I'm not getting greeted with the pop-up after any kind of delay. I'm only going to get greeted with the pop-up once I've commented. So I've enjoyed the post. I'm going to comment and talk about how much I love the post. Oops, I've already said that. Okay, I've done this demo too many times. Okay, I need to write something else. This was a great post. And then I'm going to get the Flyin, as you see. So this only targets visitors who have commented on your post and enjoyed the post. It's a really great way to get more shares. So I would suggest enabling that. And you can use these triggers in conjunction with each other. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all type thing. So you can, let's say you want to trigger after inactivity to get the visitors who you think have been lost and gone idle. And so you're targeting kind of like in a way, your least engaged visitors and trying to capture them. And at the same time, you've enabled trigger after commenting and engaging with your most engaged visitors. You're kind of hitting both ends of the spectrum. So you can actually enable all these at once. And it won't be too annoying because we only show the pop-up once per page view. So it's not like all these triggers are going to be, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the Flyin, not the pop-up, but you only see the Flyin once per page view. So it's not like each of these triggers is going to keep triggering the Flyin over and over again as they scroll down the page. You can actually enable all of these and kind of, pick and choose which ones you think are most effective for your audience. Okay, next up is the trigger after scrolling. So this is very similar to the trigger at bottom of the post, which in that case, when they scroll to the bottom of the post is triggered. But in this case, the trigger after scrolling trigger lets you decide exactly when and how much they have to scroll before the Flyin appears. So if for whatever reason you want to say, hit people 50% down the page, depending on your content, that might actually be more effective than 100% down the page. Maybe you want to get them right in the beginning. It's really up to you. So if you want to have a bit more granular control about where that fly-in appears, at what percentage down the page it appears, then you can enable this trigger. And once you enable the trigger, you're going to get a % down the page option, so you can choose at what % down the page the visitor is shown the fly-in. So by default, it's set to 50 here. I'm just going to keep it there to show you what it does. So I'm going to refresh the page and then scroll 50% down the page, and you can see the fly-in is shown. Next up is the trigger after purchasing. So this is much like the trigger after commenting. It only displays the sharing fly-in after the user has partaken in a very specific action, in this case, purchasing a product through WooCommerce. And right now we just support WooCommerce, but we may support more systems in the future. And if we do, you'll see a note of about that below the video. So in this case, if someone has visited your page, they love your brand, they love your product so much that they purchased the product, they're actually probably most likely to share, more likely to share than any other visitor, because they're so engaged. In fact, they may be a big fan of yours. So in this case, once they've gone through the checkout process and they purchase the product, on the success page, you're going to get the fly-in. It's going to ask them to share how much they love your brand and how much they love your product. So if you want to, if you're selling products through WooCommerce, I would highly suggest that. And again, it's only targeting your most engaged visitors, which means you're not annoying the passerbyers. Next up is the display once per session option. What this does is it limits the amount of times that fly-in will appear per visitor session. So let's say you have the fly-in enabled in all your posts, and you're worried that visitors who are very engaged and going from post to post and reading a lot of your posts, you're worried that they're going to get annoyed with all the fly-ins that are appearing over and over again, and you only want them to see one fly-in per session. So when you enable this, the fly-in will only appear once per session that you can adjust here. So you adjust the session duration. Let's say it's 1 day. The visitor is only going to be shown one fly-in per day, no matter how many pages they visit. And when they come back the next day, they'll get to see another fly-in. And you can adjust that to how many ever days you like. Next up, we have the share counts option, which allows you to either enable or disable the share counts, which is a count of how many times your page has been shared on each network, and that appears within each sharing button. So if I enable display share counts and I click save, you're going to see that the Flyin now has a bunch of zeros here in each button, and that's because my post has never been shared before. I'm just using this test installation on my local host, but in your case, you probably have a few shares. And so the amount of shares on each network will appear within each button here. Now, speaking of zero share counts, if you don't want to have a bunch of zeros being displayed on your page, well, then we have a setting for that as well. So if you notice when you enable the display share counts option, so I'm going to disable it and then enable it one more time, you'll see that this second option called minimum count display appears, and this is where you can adjust the minimum count threshold, which is the minimum amount of shares that must be reached in any individual network before a share count is displayed. So let's say you only want to display a share count when your post has been shared at least 10 times within any specific network. You can put 10 here, and let's say you had 10 shares on Facebook, 20 shares on Google+, and zero shares on Twitter. Well, you're going to get a 10 and a 20, and instead of a 0, for Twitter, you're just going to have no share counts displayed there. So in my case, if I enabled 10, since I have all zeros, then all my counts are going to be gone here, which I think is actually a better effect than having a bunch of zeros. I think it's more enticing to your visitors to see no share count if that share count happens to be 0, because the 0 might actually deter people from sharing. So this is a good option to have enabled, and I'd probably have it set to at least 1. Okay, next up is the display total shares option. And this will tally up all the shares you have and create a total share count above the buttons. So if I enable this, well, in my case, since 0 times 6 is still 0, I'm going to get a 0 shares here. But you can see this is where the tally appears right above the buttons. And if I had 10 shares on Facebook and 30 on Twitter and 40 on Google, well, I'd have an 80 up here, 80 total shares. Next up is the display network names, and this is going to display the name of the network to the right of the icon and to the left of the share count. So I'm going to enable that and show you what that looks like. As you can see here, we have the name of the network: Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Google. And so if you want to enable those, you can. Finally, we have the Display All Networks button. What this will do is add a new button next to all the other buttons, which when clicked will give users the option to share on any network that Monarch supports. And so if you want to allow people to share anywhere, but you don't want to clutter your Flyin with 30 different buttons, well, you can enable the All Networks button, and that'll still give people the opportunity to share anywhere without cluttering your page up. So just an example. So let's say under my networks here, I only want to display these 5 networks. But I still want people to be able to share anywhere and not be limited by those networks. But I've decided, well, these are the most popular ones, so I'll display those. And in addition, I'll still put the All Networks button below that. So back to our Flyin settings, if I enable the All Networks button and refresh the page here, you'll see that a new button is displayed after all the rest of the buttons. And when this is clicked, you'll get a pop-up that displays all the networks, and your users can share anywhere they like. Next is the remove icon spacing. So when the icon spacing has been removed, then all the buttons will become kind of one colorful block. It's purely a design decision, so it's up to you which style you like better. But just to show you what this looks like, I'm going to enable that option and refresh the page, and you'll notice that between each button, the spaces have been removed, creating this kind of multicolored block appearance, which is a cool effect, and if you happen to like it, then you can enable that option. Finally, we have the Hide on Mobile Devices option. What this will do is hide the Flyin if someone's visiting your site on their mobile phone. So in many cases, you might have multiple sharing locations enabled. You might have a pop-up, a Flyin, and that floating social sidebar. And while that's not too overbearing on a desktop, you know, it might be okay to have that floating sidebar, and as you reach the bottom of the post, a second Flyin comes in to give your visitors that extra nudge. Well, on the phone, there's much less real estate, and you might not want to have all those locations enabled. In fact, I recommend only having the floating sidebar enabled on mobile and having the rest appear only on desktop. So in this case, since it's the Flyin, I would recommend disabling it on mobile devices if you also have the floating sidebar enabled, for example. And like I said, when this is enabled, that Flyin will appear on your desktop computer, but will not appear on a mobile device such as a smartphone. Next up, we have our color settings, and this allows you to override the default colors with your own custom colors. So by default, we use the colors that best represent the brand colors of each network. So Facebook will be blue, Twitter will be a lighter blue, Google Plus will be a kind of orange-red. But if that kind of rainbow effect of that rainbow block effect is clashing with your design, if you think that clashes with your design a little bit too much, you want to kind of subdue it and choose some colors that look better with your website, well, then you have the control to do that here. So if you enable the Use Custom Colors, then you can start selecting from these 4 settings, which are background color, which is the background color of the button you see as soon as they appear, the hover background color, which is the background color of the button that appears as your mouse hovers over it, and the icon color, which also affects the text and the share count, which by default is white, but you can change that to something else. So for example, if you've adjusted your background color to be kind of a light gray, well then a white icon color is not going to show up very well, so you probably want to change that to a dark gray. And then the hover icon color, which is the color of the icon and the text that appears as you hover over the button with your mouse. So let me just enable some of these. I'm going to choose an orange background color and a red background hover color, and then I'm going to keep my icon colors white, since that's going to show up great on these dark oranges and reds. And refresh the page, and you can see I get now an orange background color with a red hover background color and the white text. Now if I go back and I let's say I change this to a light gray, and I don't think my icon color of white is going to show up very well in that light gray. Well, I might want to change this to black instead, or some other darker color. And as we refresh, you'll see that now we have the black text on the light gray. So you have full control over your icon colors and your background colors of those sharing buttons. Okay, the final setting here is the post type setting. And this is where you can control where on your website that Flyin appears. And you can do that on a post type basis, which means you can have your Flyin either appear or not appear on different post types. So by default, WordPress comes with 2 post types, which is posts and pages, but you may have additional post types. For example, if you're using Divi, the Divi theme, you might have the project post type, which is used for the portfolio. And if you're using WooCommerce, you might have the product post type. So here you can say, like, let's say you want your Flyin to only appear on products and nowhere else. So you're running an e-commerce site, you might have a bunch of products, and then you might have like an about page and a contact us page. You probably don't want people sharing your contact page. It's just not a very likely use case, but people very much might want to share your products, the products that they like the best. So you might want to enable the Flyin only on products, or you might want to just enable it on your homepage and your posts. If you're running like a publication, you probably definitely want to have sharing buttons on your posts. And like I said, less likely you want to have it on your pages, your contact page, or about us page. But here you can have full control of where that Flyin is placed on your website. And that is a basic overview of the Flyin sharing location for Monarch.